Hello again, everybody, and thanks for joining us for Backyard Farmer. I'm Kim Todd. We've got another great show for you tonight. As you just saw, we are doing some pruning and some planting, as well as answering all your gardening questions. We'd love to hear from you. If you've got a question for us, you can just call 402-472-1212 if you live in Lincoln. Toll-free number is 1-800-676-5446. Emailed questions and pictures go to byf@unl.edu. Remember, we answer those on future shows. You've got to give us as much information as you can, including at least which part of the state you live in. During the week, be sure to check out our social media options: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Pinterest. So, Jody, this was triggered by questions that we are all getting about this little thing that is sort of a beastie.
Yeah, so it doesn't look like a cute little bug that I usually bring in. So this is the ash flower gall mite, the symptoms of it when it comes to the ash tree. So it's a mite, so not an insect, that feeds on the ash tree and creates this unsightly mass here. So it is very brown and woody right now at this time of year, so people are not liking it, but we do not recommend any treatment for it. But if you do have an ash tree, we do recommend evaluating your tree to find out if it's a good candidate for emerald ash borer treatment. So not to worry about this, because it is not going to harm the health of your tree in any way.
All right, perfect. And as long as you're talking about EAB.
Yeah, EAB is the important one, because we do love our ash trees.
All right, thanks, Jody. Okay, Bill, technology.
Technology. So if you ever wanted to maintain your lawn like a golf course, you see one of the things that golf courses do is they're really efficient with how they water, because they want to keep it just wet enough so the grass doesn't wilt, but dry enough so that the grass is firm and fast and plays well and is healthy. And so one of the ways they do it is through technology to help them apply their water more efficiently. And so now we're seeing that technology going from the high-end golf courses even down to our house. And so this is the app that I use to control the controller at my home. And so I have 5 zones programmed into here. And it's an app. There's a lot of brands make them, and this is Orbitz, Rainbird, Toro. They all make these type of apps. With their systems, they're relatively affordable, under $100. And the great thing about these are, you can turn your irrigation on by the click of a button, which is fun to scare your dogs. But the better thing about it is it's getting the weather data. So when you have a rainfall event, it knows to suspend your irrigation cycle. If you look here at the bottom, it tells me how much soil moisture I have in my soil in my backyard right now. It's about 39% of plant available water is there, of the 100% that could be there. So the app is keeping track of that information. It's a little bit harder to set up, though. You need to know things like what's your precipitation rate, so how much water do you put down per hour. Enter in some information like the soils, the slope. Once you get that entered, then the app does all the math for you, and it only waters when the grass needs water, and so we can become a lot more efficient in our irrigation.
That's really cool. That's really neat technology. You got to have that irrigation system first, though, right?
Yeah, you need the irrigation, and if you do have dogs, they hate it, but it's a lot of fun. So.
Okay, Amy, something that probably could kill you.
Could kill you. Well, it's a fun time of year. Depending on where you're at in the state, it's time to go looking for morel mushroom time and scouting for all those wonderful little delicacies. So this is a sample that Kyle got in the lab this week. And as you can see, it's a fairly large mushroom. Some might consider it looks like a morel mushroom. The individual who sent these in actually was thinking maybe they were the hen of the woods. And this is actually neither. It's a little early to see hen of the woods. They like the temperatures to be a little bit warmer. It is perfect timing for morels right now. With it getting dry the last week, we might not be seeing as much in the eastern part of the state. Northern part of the state, north central part of the state, you're definitely going to look at them. But this is a false morel. And how can I tell the difference between this, a false morel, which is poisonous? If it doesn't kill you, you're going to feel pretty ucky for a long time, so you don't want to eat these. So how do you tell the difference between this and a real morel is by cutting it open. A false morel is 100% solid in the center here. So it almost looks like brains in the inside. If it's a true morel, it is hollow on the inside. So where all this meat is here, there'd be no tissue whatsoever. That is the quick, easy way to identify the difference between a morel and a false morel. But bottom line, if you're not sure what you are collecting, do not eat it. There are several mushrooms out there that we could collect that can make you feel pretty sick and ucky for a few days. And some of them are psychedelic, and some of them do have the potential of killing you if you eat them in large enough doses. So if you're uncertain, definitely consult some references, send it into the clinic for Kyle. Otherwise, just enjoy them where they're at and allow somebody else come along and harvest them who's very sure of what they're collecting and eating.
Or you hope they're sure.
You hope they're sure, yes.
All right, thanks, Amy. All right, Sarah, not your usual beauty on that end of the table.
Yeah, no, I didn't bring anything pretty tonight. So I guess what I wanted to point out is that this is a good time of year to take a look at your plants, and they can give you a gauge of how healthy they are, how well they're doing by how they come out in the springtime. So here I've got a redbud sample, and we've got a significant amount of dieback on this redbud. I mean, we can see quite a few branches here that have no growth on them, no living buds really to be seen. I'm sure if I snapped some of these, they would be dry. So this plant is telling me that it's struggling. It's stressed, and there could have been a lot of things that have gone wrong with this plant. This particular one is relatively newly planted. It's a redbud out in full sun, which is not a good site for redbuds. It may not have received enough water in the fall, and so that could be accounting for some of the dieback as well. Here's a sample of smoke bush. So we also have a fair amount of dieback on this. This is just one small branch. This whole tree had quite a bit of branch dieback in it as well, which is definitely a signal that this tree is not doing very well. Here's another one. This is a spruce. Spruces are very well adapted in Nebraska, so to have a plant like this that has so much browning of the needles is a warning sign that there's something going on with this plant for it to have so much scorching of the needle tips like this. So, if you see symptoms like this in a plant, you definitely want to, try to figure out what's going wrong, what can you do from a management standpoint that would help this plant be healthier so that, it doesn't die completely.
Thanks, Sarah. And again, it's don't spray it with something.
Right. None of these are disease issues or insect issues.
Right.
These are all environmental problems that the tree is having.
All right, thanks. All right, Jody, you get the first picture. And this is actually, we had two different viewers send us pictures of this little guy. This one is from Platte River State Park. He was wondering if it's a tick, and it's so red. And he does say it was only about 1/8 of an inch long. So what is this?
Okay, so it's not a tick. Platte River State Park's pretty awesome, by the way. But it's a red velvet mite. And if you look really closely at it, and it's actually it's really large for a mite, but you can look really closely. They're fuzzy, they look like velvet, and they're red. A lot of times they're in the woodlands on moss, and so they do pop with the green and the red, and they're pretty adorable. They're just basically looking for food, so they feed on invertebrates and insect eggs. And as the larvae, they may attach and are ectoparasites to other insects. So sometimes you see other insects with little red spots on them. That could be that mite. But I also think they remind me of the Looney Tunes character Gossamer, that big red furry monster, right? So
They're only this big.
Yeah, but, yeah, they're pretty neat. But it's neat that people are getting outside and taking notice of these living creatures.
All right, thanks, Jody. All right, stripes in the grass, Bill.
Stripes in the grass.
That's your first one is
From a mower?
Oh, well, she doesn't think so.
No, not that.
Dark green, healthy-looking turf. This is in Omaha. It is not the path of an underground sprinkler system.
Yep.
What is it?
To me, looks like fairy ring, which is a kind of disease. It's not really a disease. It's caused by basidiomycete bacteria, or fungi, excuse me, that are eating dead organic matter in the soil. And then organic matter has nitrogen fertilizer in it, so when they start to decompose that organic matter, it releases nitrogen fertilizer. So when I look at that whole lawn, to me it looks pretty lean, like it probably could benefit from a little bit of fertilizer itself. So you put a little bit of fertilizer down and you're gonna help to mask it. It's something we're not gonna wanna treat, and that line will just continue to move out as those basidiomycete fungi are continuing to spread and kind of devour the thatch and other decaying organic matter in that soil. So perfectly normal. A little bit of nitrogen fertilizer will help to mask it. Sometimes it can dry out a little bit in the summertime, so you might have to do a little bit of hand watering in those areas. But in a native soil like in Omaha, I doubt that. That'd be more of an issue in the central sand part of the state, Sand Hills region, where that soil can dry out a little bit. So.
All right. Unless you have a neighbor who is playing games with you and creating crop circles with too much fertilizer.
Who would ever do that?
Oh, I can think of a couple turf guys in our department that might do that. All right, Amy, this is actually very interesting.
Okay.
This is peonies transplanted in Cambridge 18 years ago. In the past 5 years, I think our viewers can see the ones in the middle, and then there's the close-up of the ones that just look like this. Any ideas, chemical, soil, fungal, bacterial, and then the follow-up to that was that she was using preen to control the weeds, and then Tordon was used to get a mulberry out of roses about 6 feet downhill from the peonies.
Okay.
So are we thinking this is disease?
It could be a combination of a couple of things. They said these were transplanted 18 years ago. So at that point in time, we were not going to look at a transplant issue unless you've had more soil move in. Peonies are very sensitive on how deep they are, but typically it usually results in limited flowering. This red coloration is really an indication of something isn't going on. And this viewer mentioned Tordon. And Tordon is one of those chemicals you have to be very, very careful with. So they said they sprayed a mulberry tree 6 foot away. Well, the trick with Tordon is it translocates or it moves to those roots. So whenever those roots can cross over with another plant, that chemical can cross over. So if potentially that mulberry had been able to reach out that far and they crossed, we could have had a little bit of chemical transfer that occurred. Now, how do we determine how big that root system is? It depends on how big your tree is. My rule of thumb is however tall it is, that's how wide and deep the roots go. The other thing I would want to double check on those is making sure for some reason if that spot isn't getting too wet, making sure we're not having a root rot issue going on in there. As they were coming up here in the last couple of weeks, we did have a few rain events that could make it a little too damp. Make sure that soil isn't too damp. Pull it back if it is, let it dry out. If it is that Tordon transfer, you're just gonna have to wait and see how the plant does. It may survive or it may not, so it's kind of a wait and see game right now.
All right, but probably won't spread to the other ones at this
Probably will not spread to the others.
All right. Sarah, this is actually a couple viewers, both of whom have green giant arborvitae. The first is a Seward viewer. There's a wound on the trunk on this one, but he says the tree is doing pretty well. What do you think on this one in terms of maybe kind of sorta?
Yeah, the wound, I mean, the plant, and we have a limited picture here, obviously, but the plant looks fairly vigorous. So my assumption is that if it stays alive, it probably will seal over that wound. So you can go ahead and leave it and give it a chance to try to do that.
The second one is a lot of green giants in the center part of the state used as a windbreak, and they're dying pretty rapidly.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that one?
Really, the more underlying problem with that is that arborvitae like this are not well adapted to Nebraska, and so they struggle a lot with our extreme conditions. They don't like dry soil. They're not particularly wind resistant. You know, they're more adapted to acidic, high organic matter soils with even moisture and regular irrigation. So, I mean, think, you know, Oregon, Washington, those kinds of places. So they struggle in Nebraska. They don't do well as windbreak trees because we get too much wind and they can get desiccated very easily. So that's the big drawback to arborvitae in Nebraska. So you really need to take care of them well. You really need to make sure they're well mulched. You need to make sure that they stay well watered, especially during dry periods. You need to water them late into the fall so that they have plenty of moisture going into the winter. And even with that, you may end up with some desiccation in some years. So it's just a little bit of a problematic plant for Nebraska.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Well, we did have a long, long winter that really didn't seem like it was ever going to end. Kind of put a damper on getting excited to get out there and put plants in the ground. Warmer weather is pretty obviously here. We do have some veggies poking out of the ground, and here to give us a few tips on early spring vegetables is Terry James.
that we get asked all the time is, when can we start planting in our garden? Everybody loves to have that first tomato and those peppers for those great salads in the summertime, but we always tell you to hold off until middle of May to the end of May. But one thing you can start planting early are cool season crops. Whether you're planting in the ground, in a raised bed, or in a container, those crops are ones that you can start very early here in Nebraska. But first you need to figure out when your last frost date is. In the eastern part of the state, it is usually around May 10th. In the central part of the state, it's usually about May 13th. And in the western part of the state, it's usually about May 18th to 20th. So remember those dates, and then we'll just have to start counting back from there. Next, you need to know and understand the difference between cool season plants and warm season plants. So cool season plants are the ones that can be planted before the last frost date. They have a little bit shallower root zone, they will germinate in much cooler soil, and they have a little bit shorter life. Some of the best cool season veggies to consider are kale, cabbage, broccoli, leeks, radishes, but there are two cool season perennials that you can also consider, and that is rhubarb and asparagus. You need to remember to plant these a little bit earlier. One of the reasons we consider them cool season plants is they have a little bit shorter growing season, and they kind of start to change some of their textures or taste as soon as the heat comes on. So for example, radishes get a little woody, kind of fibrous, and get kind of that really bad peppery taste. Broccoli starts to bolt, which is the process of switching from a vegetative plant into its reproductive plant and starting to put seeds on. And asparagus and rhubarb kind of start to get real woody and kind of very fibrous and not tasty anymore at all once the warm season starts. So if you didn't get your cool season plants in this time of year, because we are almost the middle of May and it's starting to get pretty warm here in Nebraska, don't forget you can still plant cool season plants in the fall for a fall crop. Usually about the 1st of August, make sure that you know when your first frost date is, count back from the seed packet how many dates you need before harvest, and then go ahead and plant those. A lot of those cool season plants are actually best planted here in Nebraska in the fall, such as Brussels sprouts. They have a very long growing season before harvest, and they actually taste a lot better when you have a little bit of frost on them. So consider planting cool season plants in Nebraska, whether you're planting them early in the spring, like in March or April, or if you're not starting them until August. They're a great tasty way to add something to your garden.
We benefited from having a little hoop house out in one of our raised beds, and you can see the results of that in all those plants in that bed. That warmer environment and temperatures really does let us get off to a good start with our vegetables. As Terry said, fall is another time to put them in the ground for those early season because it is pretty darn hot for them right now. They will bolt. All right, picture 2. This is fun. Also, Jody, this is a Torrington, Wyoming viewer. So out from the Panhandle, 3 pictures attached. Saw them last year. They're back this year near the House Foundation. Anything to be concerned about?
Okay, so first of all, they're not anything to be concerned about. It was very interesting. I had to do a lot of reading for this because there are over 60,000 types of weevils. So these snout beetles, and if you can see them closely, they kind of look like Gonzo. They've got this snout, and these are broad snout weevils. The weevils we do see a lot inside are the ones from the bird seed, so like granary weevils and rice weevils and maize weevils. So these are definitely outdoor weevils. They will feed on plants, and so depending on where you live, I'm not familiar with this area in Wyoming, but if there are apple trees or strawberries, a lot of different crops, tons. There are probably 12 different crops. So if there's something growing out there, that could be a reason that they're seeing so many, just being in the vicinity. But I would not recommend any treatment. I wouldn't be worried at all. But it's very interesting. we have not seen those around here. So
Very good. We love getting things from the western part of the state or surrounding states, Wyoming. So thanks for sending that. All right, Bill, Fremont, a little closer to home.
Yep.
All these images are of a weed or a weedy grass that is taking over his lawn. He wonders what he can do about it.
Yeah, it's tough. Grasses are really difficult to identify because we have to look really closely at where the leaf meets the stem, and we look for some things called auricles, which are kind of like claws that wrap around the stem, or we look for a ligule, which is kind of like a tongue that sticks out at the base of the leaf. We have to roll them to figure out their orientation, how the leaf is coming outside of that crown, that growing point. You know, we looked at it. We think it probably it could be a forage type of a tall fescue. It's a perennial grass, like the turf type tall fescues. Could be potentially a couple other grasses though, but without really having a sample, it's hard to know definitively. In most cases, if it's a cool season perennial, there's not going to be good selective control, so we're going to have to go to a non-selective like a glyphosate. And you know, we've talked about the glove of death type of a thing. Another thing you can do now is you can get Roundup in like a deodorant stick, and you can actually just kind of hit the leaves that way. And that's one way to try to minimize the damage to the desirable turf grass that's there. A lot of times too, those really forage grasses, the more you mow them, the more that they kind of just disappear naturally too. So.
All right, thanks, Bill. The deodorant stick of Roundup.
Yeah.
Good image there.
Yeah, don't mix them up.
Oh, interesting thought there. All right, Amy, this is an oak. Took the pictures on a rainy day. The trunk turns green from the moss, which is just fine, but this is the first time he's ever seen the blackened area on the base. It's about 50 years old, so this is an older tree. This is in the Omaha area.
Okay.
What do you think?
So this image is really good of it up close. If you take a look at it, it looks like there's been some damage to this root, whether it's been lawnmower blight, critters chewing on it, squirrels, ground squirrels, different components like that. But if you really take a look at it, besides that potential injury, it's really wet. And so it's weeping or oozing. And so typically when we're looking at the root flare, we don't call it a canker. But it is a fungal infection of that area, probably most likely leading to some type of root rot to that oak tree. There isn't anything you can do for treatment for that tree. How long will the tree be able to sustain that injury or that infection? It's really hard to say. The tree could live for another 30 years. It just depends on how intensive it is. The one thing that you really do want to be careful with that weeping, with that injury, as you notice there's grass all the way up to the trunk of the tree. That's not something we necessarily recommend. We like that nice mulch ring around, that way we don't get the lawnmower blight associated with it. But if you are going to put mulch in there, you got to be careful because it is weeping. It can get too wet and we can then enhance or progress that fungal disease from developing even further. So nothing to worry about. It's just the course of the tree, but I would definitely consider maybe pulling some of that turf away from the base of the tree.
All right, thanks, Amy. All right, Sarah, this is what is this odd thing hanging from the branches question, and calls them dried out marshmallow looking things.
This is an annual weedy vine called wild cucumber, and the fruits of this will get to be about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long at maturity, and the fruits are single. They're produced singly on the stems. There's a related weed called burr cucumber, which has much smaller fruits. They're usually about 1/2 inch long, and they're in clusters of 5 or 6 or something like this. So this is wild cucumber. It's an annual, so it means it's growing from seed every year, and you know, just uses the shrubs to climb on, to just use them as a structure to grow on. This is native to Nebraska, so it's not an introduced plant, and it does actually have some habitat value because birds do use it when it covers shrubs. They use it as kind of an escape site, you know, where they can kind of get away from predators and other kind of critters and things like that. So since they just saw it as an oddity, they're probably not too interested in control, but you know, it's an annual, so you'd want to do some like hand hoeing or some pre-emergent or something like that to prevent the seeds from germinating.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Well, fresh herbs are a must for everybody who's a chef out there. We've had some really good luck with the herbs in our garden. Here's Terry again to tell us which herbs will be popping up this season in the Backyard Farmer Garden.
This week in the Backyard Farmer Garden, we're going to check out what we have left in our herb garden. Last year, our herb garden looked really good. We had a lot of wonderful herbs that we added to our culinary experiences in the Backyard Farmer Garden. We do have a handful of perennial herbs that made it pretty well through the winter. As you can see, we have a couple different kinds of chives. We have the Geisha garlic chive, which is an All-America Selection winner. Just plain regular chives that are great on top of a baked potato. We also have some oregano and we have some sage. Those are both great winter hardy herbs here in Nebraska. Along with our perennial herbs, we will be adding a bunch of annual herbs to our garden too. We have basil and cilantro already started in the greenhouse. So as soon as it's warm enough, we'll be bringing those back out to add to our perennial herbs. So if you have a garden and you want to add some herbs to your garden, these are great ones to be adding. Stop by the Backyard Farmer Garden and check them out.
You know, we love those herbs in our dinners, but there are some gorgeous ornamental varieties as well, and there really are. So you can both eat them and enjoy the pretty. All right, just regular old questions, Jody. This is a bur oak question. 6 of these. One is quite large already, but he's seeing the little round, bullety kinds of growths. What are those, and what can you do about them?
Oak bullet galls.
Yeah.
Wasps do that, but there's not really a whole lot you can do. If they're really big trees, I don't know how you would treat that. It wouldn't be economical to do that, but it's not going to harm the tree. If you can reach them, you can prune them out.
Okay, we're seeing more bullet galls in this part of the state too on a lot of our different oaks, which is, again, here we go with changes in our environment. All right, Bill, an Omaha viewer, has brown patches in their bluegrass lawn when it's hot. They used a product that controls brown patch and other diseases, says it's effective for 4 weeks. When should it be applied?
So it's probably not brown patch right now. We're way too dry. I mean, we have like desert-like humidities going on across the state. So there's not really a lot of turf pathogens going on, so you shouldn't need to be applying anything like that. If it's a finer textured leaf, it potentially could be rough bluegrass or Poa trivialis, which it has very short roots, and so when it's wet, it looks fine, and then when it dries out, it just goes brown and it gets really sunken and can kind of die out. So that potentially could be what it is. Not a lot of really good selective control options for a homeowner besides a non-selective, or it could be bluegrass just going dormant because it's dry, which is fine this time of year. It pushes roots for the summertime.
All right, so in other words, don't treat until you know.
Yeah, this is first thing about IPM is know what your pest is before you're spraying pesticides.
All right, thanks, Bill. This is also a Torrington question, Amy. They have questions about honey locust with some interesting things on the bark, bigger honey locusts. Talk a little bit about cankers and what they would look like on a honey locust.
Well, I had a sample shown to me via a picture today, and I'm hoping to bring it the next time I'm on the show, maybe in June when I'm on. So what you're going to see for canker and honey locust, and a lot of our trees are very susceptible to this. There's a couple different forms of canker. We can actually see the bark kind of split apart. It looks like an injury of some sort. And then there's some cankers that are actually going to sink back in. And with either type of those cankers, usually the bark gets a different color. It becomes darker in color or lighter in color, depending on what tree species we're looking at. And then if you start looking really close, sometimes we can start seeing little black bumps or little white bumps around those cankers or those sunken in areas or broken open areas of that bark. And those are the fruiting structures of the tree. The biggest thing that you're going to look for is you're going to see the decline of that tree, especially that branch, because that canker inhibits the movement of water and nutrients. And so whatever part of the tree that's getting the lack of it, we're going to see smaller leaves, that we're going to see early defoliation, earlier discoloration, those different components. Now, if we want to prune those out, if it isn't the main trunk of the tree, we can prune them out. For most of our cankers, we're going to look anywhere For bacterial, we're going to say 8 to 12. Fungal, we say 6 to 8. On general, I usually say you look at 10 to 12 inches back from that canker. You make the cut and remove that, and then clean your pruners or your saw in between those cuts before you move back on. But the big trick is if you have a lot of kinkers, you need to really assess, is pruning them out really going to be beneficial for your tree or not? Or you're just going to make your tree look uglier than what it is already. So.
All right, and if it's a trunk canker, the pruning is...
Yeah, I was thinking right at the base.
Right at the base, yes.
Fine, very, very effective.
That darn 3-inch mowing height.
Yeah.
All right, Sarah, this is an Elkhorn viewer. They have a Black Hills spruce about 5 to 6 feet tall that is thrown a double leader. Should they try to, at that height, train a new one? And if so, what would they do to do that?
Sure, you can. Well, you wouldn't really need to train a new leader. You would just need to make a decision which is going to be the leader, and then you would need to do some pruning to make the other one shorter. So the way plants move growth hormones is that the tallest shoot on the plant gets the most growth hormone. So if you have 2 shoots that are similar heights, all you would need to do would be to take the one down that you want to shorten so that it's at least about 8 to 10 inches below the height of the other one. And then that one that you've left as the tallest will become your central leader. So choose a good place to trim that other shoot back to. So look for an outward growing shoot, where the plant will start to grow then horizontally instead of growing up. And then just go ahead and make that cut. And that should take care of it.
Perfect, and this is good timing too.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Sarah, you had a lot of questions that made it into the lightning round.
Okay, great. We'll see how many we can get through.
So, a Council Bluffs viewer is wondering how in the world to get rid of lily of the valley.
That's a tough one. I would go after it by digging it out and then also using a systemic herbicide like glyphosate with a spreader sticker so that the chemical holds on the foliage.
All right, a Holt County viewer is wondering why after 30 years they're not seeing any asparagus in their hay ditches. They've always harvested it from there.
Well, asparagus crowns are long lasting, but they don't live forever. So it could be that this planting has just lost vigor over time, or it could be that it's being overtaken by aggressive grasses like brome that have really reduced its vigor. So you may need to plant some.
All right. When and how can you transplant Russian sage? This is an Omaha viewer.
I would say ideally I would do it in the fall. I think that would be the very best time of year. So that would be like beginning to mid-September. You could do it in the spring also, but since we're moving quickly into hot weather, you're going to need to be more careful with it and make sure it stays well watered. And also take a pretty big sample or big crown because Russian sage doesn't transplant all that well.
Right. And, yeah. Good.
We didn't get very far. Shoot.
It's because you didn't give yes, no answers. Yeah. You gave good answers, but that was not lightning. That was heat lightning.
Yeah.
That's okay. I feel like I stand a chance now.
We'll see. All right. Are you ready, Amy?
Yes.
So is it too late in the state to spray for the needle cast diseases?
No. It really depends on where you're at in the state. For like me up in O'Neill, things are just starting to really go. So this would be the time that we want to do it. We're looking as those needles are starting to emerge.
All right. How do you keep potatoes from getting that scabby skin stuff on them?
Oh, that becomes a challenge. There are some varieties that are more tolerant or resistant to it. There are some tricks where you flood it just as the tubers are coming on, but you have to be really careful. If you flood it too much, then you're going to get a lot of bacterial root rots and the tubers go downhill. So I would look for the more tolerant varieties.
All right, this is a morel question. So in parts of the state where they're already old, will there be more if it rains again?
If we don't get too hot, that's the big trick. If we stay at these 80-degree temperatures, we're not going to see a new flush of morels. We'll be done for the year.
All right, there is white sap flowing down the trunks of white pines. Any ideas on that?
I would look at woodpecker damage or any type of wildlife damage to begin with, and then I'm going to start looking for a sunken canker because it's weeping and trying to recover from it.
All right, nice job. Okay, Bill.
Let's do it.
Okay, we have an Omaha viewer who is wondering what is the best pre-emerge to use for a really weedy lawn?
All the pre-emergents do a pretty good job at preventing the summer annuals from coming up. If you're looking for control of broadleaf annuals, then something like Gallery with some of the other ones might help. But and they all work pretty well if applied properly.
All right. This is also an Omaha viewer that got 2 very different grasses out of the same bag of grass seed. Why?
Well, making sure we have certified seed is probably the most important thing. Don't just buy the cheap seed that you don't know where it came from. It should have stated varieties and look for a blue tag or some type of state certification on a label.
All right. This is a Fullerton viewer who is mowing 2 times a week and can't keep up. Can they mow their turf shorter to not have to mow as often?
No, that's not what you should do. Actually, if you scalp it, it will grow faster. So just fight it through. It's going to get slow here in a couple weeks, so just be patient.
All right. This is a Blair viewer that has a fine textured grass in their bluegrass and their ryegrass, and it goes dormant in the summer.
It sounds more like, again, that Poa trivialis, that rough bluegrass. You know, non-selective controls are usually going to be the best for it, like shade too. So if you see it in the shade, that would make sense too.
Okay. All right, Jody.
Okay.
Last and not least, ready?
Yep.
So, will a cardboard tube around the base of squash plants stop squash vine borers?
It can if you do it properly and attach it. We try to put a band with aluminum foil over to keep it there so they can't climb up it.
All right, this is a Crofton viewer who wants to know, is there such a thing as a very safe for humans tick and mosquito repellent?
Very safe for humans. Well, if you use it according to the label, it should be safe. But what I like to do is use permethrin treated clothing.
Okay. This person saw one bumblebee about 1.5 inches long. Is that possible?
Yes, it could be. Or it could be a carpenter bee as well. They're out.
All right. How do you get rid of large ant mounds in the middle of a lawn?
You can probably find a drench for that if you need to treat them. I don't know if that would render more. If it would, you probably should do that.
Is there, can you use a systemic pesticide for Japanese beetles on plants where you want to harvest the nuts and the fruits?
There was a Bayer product. You just need to make sure you read the label and find the exact fruit tree and then find the pre-harvest interval because they will be different. So you want to make sure you're eating safe food.
Wonderful. So pre-harvest interval is the huge
Yes.
big one on that one for people.
Label,
Okay.
label.
Look at those labels.
Label, 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 and read.
There's a lot of information on those things.
They're on there for a reason. All
did
right,
win.
Sarah, what do we, yeah, you did win. What? All of a sudden she discovers. All right, Sarah, what are our plants of the week this week?
So we've got a really pretty little peony here in the front. This is, you can see it's kind of a more open flower. It's got just more of a single layer of petals. This would be called an anemone type peony. This particular cultivar is called Sweetie, and it does have a really nice fragrance to it. It reminds me a little bit of a rose scent to it. And it has, if you look here at the foliage is a little bit different than what we would see with a traditional peony. It's much more finely textured foliage. Not a true fern leaf, but a very, divided leaf, which can give you an interesting look in the landscape, compared to our traditional peonies. So earlier blooming, obviously, than our regular peonies. So this is a nice little cultivar called Sweetie. And then this plant in the back with the yellow flowers, this is a false lupin. So if you're familiar with our regular lupin, you can see the flowers look very, very similar to false blue indigo. But this is in a different genus. This is Thermopsis. And it's still a legume, so it's still in the bean family. Once it's established, very drought tolerant and makes a nice perennial with these beautiful early yellow flowers for the landscape. So that's false lupin, excuse me. little brain check there. So.
It's the scent of the Sweetie peony.
Yeah, maybe so, maybe. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Sarah. All right, picture number 3 for you, Jody. The bagworm pictures have started coming in. This is a spruce in Omaha. Pulled as many off as they could reach. When is the best time and what can be used? And then the damage to the current branches is of great concern. He says they're still pliable, but clearly they don't have any viable buds left on them.
Right. I would probably remove those, but it's good that they're picking the bags off right now. If you see them, you can still pick them off. The best time to treat, and we recommend using BT, like Dipel. There's spinosad, and there are pyrethroids as well. But it's all about timing, and so I have had a lot of people call and they're just waiting for the time. If the eggs are in the bag, so that's how they have overwintered, and it's hard to determine which bags are still viable. So the eggs will be released and they'll kind of use their silk and their little caterpillars, and then they will start feeding. You want to get them at that time when they're very small, so less than half an inch long, because they do use whatever they're feeding on as a bag to protect themselves. And so you'll see them, they look like tiny little ice cream cones moving. I have had a lot of calls, so you can always call me and ask me when they start doing that. But the bagworm life cycle is very interesting. That's a whole other story, but I do love talking about bagworms. Wait for the timing, and it is something that you will want to treat for.
So that's one of those things we will tell you when to treat.
And it's like early June.
Early June.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. In a good year.
Yeah.
All right, Bill, this is a Lincoln viewer. Once again, an ID on a grass.
Okay.
2 types in their yard. They prefer not to have one of them. They don't like how it goes to seed at such a low height. Anything to prevent, or should they just get rid of it?
Yeah, this one is hard. I mean, that looks like bluegrass right there. There's different types of bluegrass. There's Kentucky bluegrass, which is desirable, and some of the older Kentucky bluegrasses can even make seed even at lower heights. If it's a light green color, it's usually annual bluegrass. It's a low-growing one. It makes a lot of seed this time of year, and so a lot of these are just it's the spring. This is when they make seed. This is why our pollen allergies are really a problem for someone like me who's actually allergic to grass. As a grass doctor. But you know, it's just going to happen this time of year, and again, there's not really any kind of selective control. You're trying to control grass, and that's hard to do.
All right, thanks, Bill. You should have chosen a different profession or a different plant species.
I just like grass.
All right, Amy, this is an Omaha viewer who has an issue with their tree. We've determined it is chokecherry or flowering plum or something like that, but they have these big old growth things that spread and kill the limbs. They sent another picture that was a little less clear, but it was a very, very large. Yeah.
So this is the common pathogen that we see on any of those prunus species, and it's black knot. So we'll see it on cherry, chokecherry, plums. It's a fungal disease, so it starts really small and then it just continues to grow, and as it grows, it then prevents the movement of that water and nutrients to the rest of the branch. This is the time of year we're going to see them, because that's when we see those big gnarly growths on them. Depending on the tree, we'll try to prune them out, but there is no fungicide recommendation that will apply to these trees or to these bushes, just because those spores are being released by that black gall or that black knot throughout the summer months whenever we get a rain event. So you'll be continuously putting an application down. The other trick is we have to take a step back and look at how many wild species of prunus that we have. So all the wild plum thickets and how far can those spores travel is actually pretty far. So you can never prune it out all the way, and you're always going to have inoculum around. So just try to prune it out as best as you can, and just go from there.
All right, thank you, Amy. All right, Sarah, another asparagus question. This is a viewer who lives south of St. Paul, along the river, sandy loam soil. She's been told to pick only the fat spears, leave the skinny ones. She doesn't have very many fat ones coming up this year. It is a 7-year-old plant, so she's wondering, you know, what could be done here to either strengthen it, or should she stop cutting?
So you might want to look a little bit at some of your management of the asparagus. So typically asparagus is fertilized in the spring before the spears start to come up. And you're going to put down about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of nitrogen per 10 feet of row, or excuse me, for about 100 square feet of a planting. Then you also want to fertilize after the harvesting is done. So that would be about a month to 6 weeks after you first started harvesting. And you're going to come back with a little bit less, about 1/3 pound of nitrogen at that late period in the year. So if you are on a sandy loam, it could be that the plants are just a little nutrient deficient, and that they're not able to be vigorous enough because they aren't getting enough nutrients that they need. The other thing I would look at would be watering. You need to have really good watering in the fern development period, because that is what really generates carbohydrates and increases the vigor of the plant, is how much they can photosynthesize for the rest of the summer. So make sure that you're watering well at that point, and hopefully those two things will help increase the vigor of your plants, and you'll get, you know, bigger, fatter spears in years to come.
All right, good advice. Thanks, Sarah. Well, a few years ago, we trimmed back our thornless blackberry Chester on the west side of the Backyard Farmer Garden. That's really his name. It's now really pretty well established, but we had a lot of winter dieback. We have some other brambles in there. We need to give them a good trimming if we're going to expect to get a really good harvest this year. So once again, let's head out to the edges of that Backyard Farmer Garden and get to pruning. You might recall a couple of years ago when we did a video on how you should prune your brambles. We were talking specifically about Chester, our thornless blackberry, that had decided to be really happy and gallop through the woods here. Well, you'll notice that after this very interesting winter that we've had in Nebraska, Chester is very unhappy. One of the issues with the thornless blackberries can be winter hardiness, and what you're seeing is actually a lot of pretty dead canes on this particular bramble. You can see some new growth at the bottom, but you can also see that the canes themselves last year were not pruned properly. They were not brought back to about a 36-inch height. The laterals were not trained. So we have a lot of dead material that we're going to have to remove from this particular blackberry. A favorite raspberry for a lot of home gardens is one called Heritage, which is considered both a summer-bearing and a fall-bearing raspberry. Interestingly enough, though, this is primocanes where the fruit is born. If you don't cut all the Heritage raspberries off earlier than this, you end up with a pretty weak summer crop or an early summer crop and a less strong fall crop. Because what happens is the old fruiting canes are still here. They have put on lateral growth. This is where the new flowers will occur. Ideally, what would happen also with Heritage raspberry is you would control its spread and put it essentially into either a less brambly location or a spot where you can actually do a little bit more picking. So at this point with our Heritage raspberry, what we're going to do is take off the old fruiting areas. We're going to consider digging or taking out some of the canes that have spread. Treat this a little bit more like a raspberry that will fruit both in the summer and in the fall, and see what happens. One of the developments in the raspberry world or the berry world is what's called brazelberries. This is raspberry shortcake. These were actually developed and bred for container production for a smaller garden. These are also raspberries that you do not want to remove any of the foliage on the plant, because to be able to put the carbohydrates into the stem and into the ground, it's very important to have as much foliage as possible. This has only been in our landscape for a single year, and actually last year it produced a lot of good fruit. So what we're really going to do here is simply take the old canes out, the old dead material. It's always very important with all of the brambles or the raspberries and blackberries to get all the dead material out whenever you see it, because that is where the inoculum for diseases can occur. We're going to leave the small runners on the sides because, again, those will be potentially fruiting canes. A very important point is to know which raspberries or brambles you have in your landscape, because there are different pruning techniques. And keep in mind also with that Heritage and the other ones that spread, if you are taking out and thinning out those plants, you want to go as low as possible down to the ground to be able to force the carbohydrates into the canes that you want to remain on the plant. You know, you can readily see how those plants can quickly get out of hand. It isn't really hard work, but it is work you have to do every single year. Keep a good eye, sharp pruners, wear gloves, especially if you are not dealing with Chester the thornless one. They will really get into and under your skin. All right, Jody, this is a Norfolk viewer. Planted a broadleaf euonymus a couple of years ago. It's done well, but then saw all this winter damage to begin with, but then white spots covering the branches like that. Used a lot of different sorts of products. Was told some sort of insect was eating the insides of the branches. What do they do here? It's really deteriorated.
Okay, well, those are scale insects on the outside. They pretty much are very lazy unless they're in the crawler stage, which is the stage to control them. Otherwise, they just kind of hunker down and sap the suck out of it. suck the sap out of the plant, and then it is unable to photosynthesize, and the plant can die over time. Those products, there is one that's a drench, which is probably too late for that, and then the other product that you were recommended is a fungicide, so that's not going to work for those insects. And if you are planning to replant something else, remove that plant, then the scale do not live in the soil, so it should be fine to plant something else.
So one that bad, just get rid of it and start over probably. All right, thanks, Jody. This is a North Platte viewer, Bill. Sandy soil, high pH, new lawn. This particular little weed is everywhere.
Yep.
Wonders, is it an annual? Should they spray? What's
Yeah,
the deal?
this is something that we see on fall seedings a lot. So you seed your lawn in the fall, and then you get the winter annuals that also can kind of come in there with that soil's bare, and you're fertilizing it and watering it. It's ideal. And so this is a corn speedwell. It's going to die when the summer comes. It's not worth really treating. Just maintaining a vigorous lawn, proper mowing, proper fertilization, and this guy won't be a problem in the future.
All right, thank you, Bill. Amy, let's see. This is a Seward viewer. Noticed powdery mildew in the fescue lawn already. Isn't it early for this, and should they do anything about it?
It's not necessarily early. If we would have looked at a few weeks ago, we got some rain events and we had high humidities and it was semi-cool. The trick with powdery mildew is like humidity. We don't have to have the free moisture or rain, just the humidity. The trick with powdery mildew, there isn't anything you can do for it. Don't recommend any fungicide applications. You could look at a few different varieties that are more resistant or tolerant to powdery mildew. That would require you to overseed it at that point in time. If it's a really shady area, the question then also comes, is turf the best option for that spot, or should I go in with a different plant species? Nothing you can do, you just have to live with it.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Okay. All right, Sarah, this is a viewer who has a maple on the east side of their house. Pretty large portion of the trunk is very scarred. It's gotten worse over the last couple of years. Wonders if this should be taken out as soon as possible, or if they should wait. And so we can see the scarring on this particular tree.
Right, so there is a lot of dead bark there, and so that really limits this tree's ability to move water up through the trunk because all that bark is dead. So that's going to really be a major stressor for the tree. The other big factor here is that all of that inner heartwood that is present at the tree at this point is going to develop wood rot. So in the next 5 to 10 years, that wood is going to start to rot, and as the tree gets bigger, then it could become an issue structurally. And see how close it is to the house. If it were to fall on the house, you would definitely have damage. There's also power lines there, which are a little harder to see in the picture. So as badly damaged as this tree is at this point, if it were my tree, I would probably take it out and start over with something that was healthy, because there's really nothing that you can do to help heal this tree. And it's unlikely that it's going to be able to completely seal over that dead bark because it's just so extensive. So I would probably cut your losses on this one and just go ahead and take it out.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. All right, so we have announcements of cool things going on in the gardening world, as always. Our first one is the Lincoln Iris Society's annual event, May 7th through the 14th, 2 to 5 p.m., St. Andrew's Lutheran Church, Lancaster Lane. We have a number on the screen. The second is the Sunset Hills Garden Club Plant Sale, May 12th, 120th at William. And again, we have an email address on the screen for people who want to know something more about that one for Mother's Day weekend, for those of you who haven't bought your mother anything yet, hint, hint. And the third is the Garden Club of Lincoln Plant Sale, which is Mother's Day, no, Monday, sorry, the day after, you're too late, Color Middle School, 52nd and Vine. So if you forget to get your mother something for Sunday, you can get it on Monday. All right.